Here's something I'm thinking about today. As I'm walking the dogs down the road on a nice fall day. A certain amount of irony and contradiction in some of this, I suppose, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. But I certainly want to preface a bit of what I'm going to share on fact, the principles of equity and justice and rights, human rights, dealing with things like systemic racism, negative discrimination, those types of things. Big part of my work for many years. Space I find myself navigating in, writing about, researching. But there seems to be an element, and I'm seeing a lot of it more in post-secondary and higher education. And we have a bit of a principle in our household, which is just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean you have to. And there seems to be, when it comes to some of these anti-racism strategies, mandates, and otherwise, a certain amount of what I guess is called FOMO, the fear of missing out, that just because another institution has it, then that means that we need to have it at our institution. And I was just reading that recently and one that was just released. And some of the principles that were laid out in here, and say it respectfully for the folks that tried to do the work on it, but there seems to be an element of just mimicking what other institutions are doing on this front, and it becomes more about the writing and the whatever else that is going into these, and it just sets up a whole pile of unresolvable contradictions in a way. So the one I was just reading recently was certainly going on about decolonizing institutions, decolonizing universities, and I struggle with this, and I'm interested in what others think about this. Is I'm not sure that you can decolonize an institution, one that might be named after a famous white European explorer that also has a river named after it, for example, or a Hudson's Bay territory, or a certain area. That's part of it. It also, probably in many cases, 50% of a post-secondary institution, at least where I live in BC, in this area called British Columbia, it comes from the government. And so about 50% of that funding comes in government grants. And in many cases, universities were granted land that still disputed territories, in many cases, unresolved, between rights and title and ongoing treaty negotiation for decades and decades and decades. So you've got 50% of the funds coming in from, quote unquote, the crown, that is what it's called. And then another 50% that comes in, and doesn't break down this easily, but a lot of it comes in from tuition. And so a big initiative right now in post-secondary and higher education in Canada, at least, is that a lot of institutions are highly reliant on international students who pay 3 to 5 times the tuition as a domestic student. Lots of cases, it's around maybe less than 30% of the overall student population, but in some cases it's approaching 60, 70, 80% of the tuition revenue is coming from international students. You think about this in the context of announcements this week from the federal government suggesting that they were going to pilot some changes to student visas for international students, shifting it from a 20-hour work restriction. In the past, international students could only work 20 hours while they were on a student visa, and now they're changing that to be closer to 40, which is going to have, I imagine, a whole line of unintended consequences. Certainly will help with the high costs, but that's a topic for another video. But essentially, this part of the reason for that change in the student visa was because the workforce, it's absolutely required in Canada. We've got super low birth rates and need more settlers coming in. And so essentially, we're suggesting, or some are suggesting, that we're going to try and decolonize institutions that are largely dependent on new settlers coming in. And I just find this an interesting conundrum and a contradiction. Added to that, I was reading this mandate around anti-racism and strategy and otherwise, and decolonize, and it started to get into capitalism. And that was where I started to get a little lost. And then I understand theoretically how some will approach and think that, but I'm just trying to sort out what is the purpose of a post-secondary education in many situations is to make folks more employable. And so when they're employable, they're earning an income and they're participating in a capitalist society. And so if we were suggesting that we're going to decolonize in relation to capitalism, what is that? What happens to the advisory committees of all the employers, which is actually a requirement for quality assurance within post-secondary in BC, is to have these advisory committees made up of employers who participate and make suggestions about how programs should run, degree programs or diploma programs in colleges. And it gets beyond even being a conundrum and a contradiction. It actually, in my mind, respectfully gets on the edge of almost silliness, in that we're starting to mention things that just probably aren't possible. And so it gets all convoluted and muddled. And the result of that, we're seeing in some cases, is backlash from folks that are just saying, this isn't possible. Why are we using these words here when we're trying to do this work here? So what I'm thinking about and wondering about what others are pondering is there some way, I don't want to say simplify, but stick to some core principles about what this work is about and how to be able to shift it. As systemic and structural racism absolutely exists. You can see it play out, so does interpersonal racism. But then when we start to mix it up with decolonizing capitalist systems and institutions which are dependent on governments, I think we start to get the conversation pulled in directions that are not going to be of assistance. They're actually going to really be a detriment to the changes that are trying to be implemented. That's some of the stuff I'm just thinking about as I'm walking the dogs down the road on a beautiful fall day. Added to that, most folks in post-secondary will be off this weekend for a holiday called Thanksgiving. If we were really going to decolonize institutions, are we going to cancel those kinds of statutory holidays? I'm not so sure we are. What do you think? Leave me some comments, preferably respectful. I find it a pretty interesting space to be sitting in and thinking about.